Launch games have to achieve a number of things in order to really convince people that a new console is worth buying. Most importantly, launch games need to demonstrate that the new console is capable on a technical level, that it can do something that the older console could not, whether that's graphically, mechanically, or both. It also needs to compare favorably with what's available on your competitors' systems. There are the truly hardcore players that will buy all of the systems available so they can play all of the exclusives, but those people are few and far between, especially when one of those consoles was retailing for up to $600. Resistance has all the makings of a hot new exclusive franchise. For starters, you have a very well thought out universe, an intriguing alternate history that serves as a World War II allegory, where instead of the Americans coming to the war late to fight the Nazis in Europe, you're fighting aliens who have invaded Europe in their place. You also have several elements that seem specifically designed to set Resistance apart from its contemporaries, including a few really neat guns. Most notably, you have the signature Bullseye weapon, which allows you to fire tags at enemies and then shoot tracking rounds at that tag blindly, sometimes even around corners. But while Resistance so clearly wanted to be a new, massive system seller for Sony, it never really succeeded. The game is very polished for the time, has some neat elements that make it unique, but ultimately it's a very solid, good, by-the-numbers shooter that not only falls slightly short of being the flagship franchise that Sony so desperately needed in order to sell their somewhat overpriced console, but it was quickly forgotten thanks to the games that would follow it. If it feels like I don't talk too much about the mechanics for this game, it's for a reason. Beyond those unique weapons, there's not a lot to talk about when it comes to gameplay. You shoot a ton of the same 3 or 4 enemies through a series of very similar set pieces, until you hit a level load where you get a change of scenery and a narrative dump that slowly pushes the plot along. And don't get me wrong, hardly any of these elements would have felt weird or bad at the time. In fact, they were par for the course when it came for shooters. As a whole, Resistance is a game that wouldn't have felt out of place at all. In fact, it compares quite favorably to its most immediate contemporary. In the same month as Resistance, we got Call of Duty 3, a very by-the-numbers sequel to Call of Duty 2 that wasn't doing anything new or interesting for the franchise, much less shooters as a whole. But it's the things that immediately followed Resistance that have hurt it the most. The following year would see the heavily anticipated sequel to Microsoft's own flagship FPS, Halo 3, but far more importantly, it saw the release of the first-person shooter that would change the landscape of the genre and the industry as a whole, Call of Duty 4: Modern Warfare. And so, Resistance has fallen into obscurity, despite the fact that it produced 2 sequels, one of which is a truly underappreciated hidden gem. And that's not really a fault of the developers. Resistance came out at a weird transitional time. If a game like this had been released earlier, say in the place of the original Killzone on the PS2, it could have ended up being the massive franchise that Sony so desperately wanted it to be. A game that would still be very fondly remembered by a large number of people today. But instead, we got a game that retains a lot of the things that were wrong with shooters in the PS2 and Xbox era, like deeply repetitive environments and enemies, terrible checkpointing, god-awful button mapping, things that I would likely excuse in a PS2 or Xbox game. But thanks to the games that followed on the PS3 and 360, I find far harder to excuse on those platforms. And that's certainly somewhat unfair to Resistance. The game is still fondly remembered by a select few, and those who really connected with one of its more memorable and unique aspects, whether that was the truly excellent weapon design or the intriguing alternate history setting. And despite my problems with it, I think more people should go back and give Resistance a try. In a landscape saturated by modern first-person shooters, any game like this one that heralds back to a simpler time is a more than welcome change of pace. Some will find its mechanical intricacies deeply lacking, its controls a bit stiff and jarring, but overall it's a fun run-and-gun shooter, something that continues to be hard to find these days. In my retro reviews, I look at games that came out at least 10 years ago, what I would consider to be retro, and I see if they've held up now, if they're still worth playing. If you like that idea, be sure to subscribe so you can see the latest videos. If you like this video in particular, be sure to hit that like button, and thanks for watching.